Canada still is by far the most important international market for US brands that need to go international. If you can't do Canada first and best, then you really need to evaluate many things and how you're approaching the globe.
Welcome to the Decoding Cross-Border Ecommerce podcast. I'm your host, Clint Reid.
Aaron Bezzant, good to be here.
Good to see you, Aaron. Hey, and today's a special day because we have a special guest, Dave Mays.
Super excited.
With Broadreach and Everything Canada. And before we jump into that, this podcast today is going to be about shipping to Canada, e-commerce shipping to Canada. But Aaron, you're going to kick us off here?
Yeah, let's kick it off with a joke about Canadians who are some of the most polite people I've ever met in my entire life. And do you know what their favorite board game is up in Canada?
What?
Sorry.
No.
Boom. Okay. All right. Hey, before we get started today, let's learn a little bit about Dave Mays. I've been familiar with mostly what Dave was building. I remember back in the days when I worked at UPS, and Landmark had entered the industry. So this was back before 2010, and I'm sure he can give us some actual dates here, but around that time. So Dave was a founder of Landmark, currently the founder over at Broadreach, and looking forward to hearing about Dave's journey a little bit here. But today, the reason we have Dave on the podcast is the vast experience that he has in Canada. So this is going to be, I think, extremely beneficial to what is the largest market for U.S. retailers, which is Canada outside, when you're shipping in internationally by far. And also for retailers that are outside of Canada outside the U.S. that are also shipping into Canada, a lot of the same principles apply, I think, even though I think Dave's, background has mostly been U.S. So Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Dave, give me a little bit about your background, how you ended up getting into shipping, cross-border e-commerce, and specifically into Canada, and some of the things you've built.
Yeah, absolutely. So without boring you with my first gig out of university, I ended up taking a year off and traveling the world. A lot of the international community calls that a gap year. Well, my gap year was at the age of 25. When I came back, I was so enamored by cultures and economies and people and language and all the various things that make us all different. I was insistent on finding something in international. Could have been anything at the time, and I tripped across an opportunity with a company called Purelator, which is the largest integrated courier in Canada. Fantastic company. Absolutely loved what I did with them and for them for 5 years. Learned a lot about the economy of Canada, e-commerce, cross-border, mostly B2B, mostly integrated express, multi-piece business deliveries, air network, ground network. Fascinating, as it was kind of between 2000 and 2005 where e-commerce was still knocking on the door of front of mind for merchants and e-tailers and omni-channel shippers. Worked for them, understood, which I think is still valid today, that integrated couriers are good at some things, superior in many regards in terms of their ability to get packages from country A to country Z. But in Canada, because of the proximity over the road, a lot of that involves trucking northbound, clearly customs clearance, tracking technology reporting, using the casual importation stream, and being able to scale that to compete with the express carriers. So using third-party, fourth-party brokers and fifth-party technology companies and sixth-party freight brokers, I felt like the opportunity in 2005, which is still the opportunity today, is to really focus on putting that together in a way that is frictionless, information-rich, obviously leverages cost efficiencies, so price effective, and customer focus in terms of both the merchant and the customer. So I started Landmark in 2005, and the world is almost 8 billion people. So I think everybody that starts into cross-border thinks about all the exotic locations around the world for us to conquer someday, and I did as well. And at the end of this 2-3 year startup period, I realized that We were good at Canada and just okay to other countries. And so we rode the value proposition to US merchants handling Canada. So I can go on about that journey for 12 years, but kind of embedded in the exit and build out of Landmark Global was the same today as it was 20 and 30 years ago. The postal authorities around the world figuring how can we get into packages. Mail is dying. Mail is becoming digital. Packages and e-commerce is growing. How do we transform our businesses? So a lot of the postal authorities would do joint ventures, acquire assets as their journey continued to transform their businesses. So this was all kind of part and parcel, no pun intended, to that.
And then, so Landmark, the journey then ended for you. There was actually an exit there. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the acquisition of Landmark, and then what you would do differently, which probably lands where you're at today.
Well, I think we were in a vulnerable position in 2012. We were a medium-sized business. So whenever you're small, you're agile, you don't have a lot of overhead. And when you're really large, you can weather storms. I feel like in 2012, we were really doing well. The growth, the package network, but also the vulnerability for a large express courier to come in and just buy a business. Amazon was starting to get into the market and push people around a bit. And I felt like we needed that partnership. We needed that capital to grow. We needed to connect international markets that we weren't strong in at that moment in time. Obviously, the big countries outside of the US, including the EU, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, we just wanted to expand more to markets where there was we could synthesize growth. In the case of my deal in particular, we had a 4-year earnout in which we rolled up a bunch of regions and units to kind of transform what Landmark is today. And at the end of all that, 2017, I exited the business. Felt good about the exit, felt good about what I left, but also knowing that there was tons of growth ahead. At that point in time, we were still 85% of our profits at the time were generated from Canada, and about 75% of our volume from the US outbound. So Canada, at the end of that 12-year exercise, and now I've been in the business for about 24 years, Canada still is by far the most important international market for US brands that need to go international. If you can't do Canada first and best, then you really need to evaluate many things and how you're approaching the globe.
Yeah, I would totally agree. So now fast forward to today, and with Broadreach, what is you think unique about Broadreach that you've built and that you're excited about? And then let's just, then we want to really just dive in really quick here into the Canadian market, but would love to hear a little more, hear about Broadreach.
Well, the French Post and the Swiss Post started a company about 11 years ago called Ascendia. Ascendia, fantastically strong in Europe. They've had legacy businesses that they've acquired in the UK and the US. Tremendous growth in Asia Pacific. With the digital side and the logistics side, today they're a $3 billion organization. But all that being said, all the way up into and through COVID, Canada still was not what I would call a premium market for Ascendia to serve. So kind of getting back into the market with their CEO here in North America, I said, look, I don't want to consult. I don't want a job. I'm a builder. I'm an entrepreneur. I need to be out, assembling things, finding problems, solving those problems, and growing. And that's really kind of what motivates most of us. I'm sure, Clint, you would agree. So part of that was doing the joint venture Broadreach, which is a majority-owned Ascendia company and will be wholly owned at the end of my 5-year JV with them to effectively build out what I think has receded a little bit in service quality to Canada during the COVID period. So some of this is blocking and tackling, doing what I've done for 24 years. And some of this is really pushing the envelope and developing new products and services that really should be standard in 2023, 24, and moving forward.
All right. Well, hey, that's some great background. Now we're excited to suck the knowledge, all the years of experience, since back in before 2005. I mean, from Pure Later, the Landmark experience, all Canada. So I think we're going to have some rich conversations here. But
yeah, I mean, Dave, you kind of touched on it already. But what is What makes Canada such an attractive market? I think you mentioned you got to get, especially for U.S. retailers, it's big, but I also see it a big market for non-U.S. retailers. It just seems like it's a really desirable cross-border market. But why? What makes it such a good market?
Yeah, the two main distinctions are its physical location, and I hate to reference Canada as our 51st state because it can be offensive to Canadians who are amazingly independent, educated, and fantastic people. But it's physically bolted on our northern border, so we can approach Canada like we would California or Florida or Texas. In that, over the road, there is an economic border, a political border. Of course, that's what the consolidators and the integrated couriers do for a living. And then, of course, delivering throughout the country. So it's physical proximity to the U.S. And then, of course, media spillover, economic spillover, digital marketing spillover, their awareness of U.S. brands and access online or even physically to U.S. brands. So it makes it culturally English speaking for the most part. It is a bilingual country, by the way, and 23% of the population is in Quebec. But only 10% of the orders, in my experience, go to Quebec from a U.S. to Canada standpoint, which means we're underserving Quebec, which is, I guess, reinforcing the fact that the English-speaking population for U.S. merchants kind of is an easy business growth plan.
That's interesting. That only 10% of the volume to Canada is going to Quebec, but 23%. Yeah, you're right. Totally underserved market. Now, You had brought up in the introduction earlier integrators. So can you define the difference between a consolidator and an integrator?
Yes, I think that's probably the most important question of the last 24 years, really, because we want the experience to feel, and again, I say this with heaps of respect for UPS, DHL, and FedEx. We want the experience to feel like we have full custody of the package from pickup to delivery.
And that's what an integrator is, correct? They have full custody of the package from pickup to delivery.
It hits a brown truck, it hits a brown plane, it hits a brown warehouse, and it's delivered by a driver in a brown van. Same thing with purple, same thing with yellow in the case of DHL. And I mean, again, I'm amazed at their ability, especially regionally to some of the more difficult markets, to do what they do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. They're fantastic companies. But to Canada, we want to replicate the experience of speed, cost efficiency, obviously visibility, DDP, which of course is part of what you do for a living, is incredibly important. That customer experience, it having the look and feel of a Canadian package, it having the expediency of something shipped from Canada, but having it actually shipped from a North American US warehouse. So integrated couriers they have in-house customs brokerage. They clearly have their own network. And along with that is sometimes packages going the wrong direction. Canada's north, sometimes packages travel south, east, or west before they ultimately end up where they should be in Canada. So consolidators are going to generally be carrier agnostic. They're going to say, we're going to assemble, like a general contractor would to a job site, we're going to assemble this the most efficient way by partners who are the most capable. Maybe it's a regional trucking company in Southern California. Maybe it's a final mile delivery partner in the Atlantic provinces that has especially good service. There's a variety of reasons why and how the consolidators operate the way they do. So you have the postal authority and you have the integrators, and a lot of what is going to make a decision on which one to use is how capable the final mile postal authority is, what the value of the products are, and whether it's cost effective or efficient, and of course the other end of the spectrum is the fully integrated couriers that will deliver it on their own equipment.
So, Dave, quick question on that, just to put myself in the shoes of an e-commerce retailer wanting to sell into Canada. What are my options for moving a package? Like, as I look at the landscape, what's out there and what should I be considering?
Well, the first question that you have to ask before you make transportation decisions is, how am I conducting this transaction, or how am I conducting business in Canada? Am I a business selling to a business? Am I a non-resident importer business registered in Canada selling to a business? Am I a registered business selling to a consumer? or am I a US business selling through a casual importation e-commerce stream to a Canadian where they're the import of record? I'm transacting and declaring in Canadian dollars from a US sale, and a variety of other things that go into exactly what's the nature or channel of that sale. So assuming the US merchant is new to international, they have no presence in Canada, they don't have wholesalers, they don't have a subsidiary, they're selling to Canadian individual consignees. The first thing clearly is, can I accept payment? Am I able and or do I calculate a landed cost? How do I choose a carrier, and what are the SLAs involved in satisfying the Canadian needs? And a lot of this comes down to, well, what's the commodity? Is it paper plates and cell phone dongles, or is it branded goods? Assuming it's branded goods, assuming that the consumer is reaching out over the internet to buy something that there's a high demand for, then you make the decision to choose a carrier based on what a 2 to 7 day delivery on average for ground, 2 to 3 day delivery for expedited. And of course, your shipping origin is a major factor. If you ship from Ohio, it's easy to serve Canada. If you ship from Southern California, it's much more challenging. Canada is generally made up of, not generally, but is made up of 80% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border. And that goes obviously along our northern border. It's a very thin, long border that is very difficult to serve depending on how you approach it. 65 or 70%, up to 75 of your orders are going to be east of Manitoba. So Greater Toronto, Greater Ontario, Quebec, and a little bit to the Atlantic provinces. And then the rest is going to be in the west. Well, the west of Manitoba involves Saskatchewan, but primarily Alberta and British Columbia. So where you're shipping from, assuming you're transacting in English, assuming you have goods where there is some urgency, the order value is above 80 USD, they would like to get it as fast as possible, and they want an overall reasonable value to pay for shipping and obviously an accurate landed cost. So you have the integrated couriers that we spoke about, you have the postal authorities, and then you have everywhere in between. Everywhere in between mostly involves ground shipping, ground consolidators, and of course, decisions made to how you're going to clear into Canada for customs. Right now, as it stands today, anything under $3,300 Canadian can be considered casual. The importer of record can be the consignee, so long as that it's not for resale and doesn't exceed a 90-day supply. 90-day supply is sometimes not really relevant depending on what commodity we're talking about. In that event, these are, as the integrators would generally not operate, the consolidators operate on a physical, literal consolidation where one truck will have up to 3,000 to 5,000 parcels. Those 3,000 to 5,000 parcels will be going to 3,000 to 5,000 individual consignees in Canada, and we will clear those electronically in the name of the consignee, 3,000 to 5,000 different customs clearance transactions. Each box will have a individual transaction ID. It will be scrutinized and or not or clear based on its contents, nothing related to the truck in general, and move on its way into Canada out for final mile delivery through a carrier partner that we would choose.
And you're doing that to keep it as a casual import, correct?
Yes. If you exceed 3,300, you're going to need a power of attorney. You're going to do a formal clearance. When you do a formal clearance, it could involve permits. You're under different set of rules and regulations for importations. Whoever is the importer of record will have to file that revenue, do input tax credit, collect, and remit GST and HST where appropriate. And the way we're discussing it now for e-commerce, everything is settled at the border. So when it comes into Canada, the border, the economic border, the physical border is where everything is assessed and ultimately remitted, and then it's free domicile delivery throughout after that.
And free domicile is, can you define that for the audience? What is free domicile? I'm wanting to make sure that we're educating the people listening on. There's definitely a lot of terms and things that I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with.
Yeah. So to kind of, simplify the transaction, the border collects the goods based on the commodity, obviously the HTS code and the country of origin. It may or may not have HST. It may or may not have PST. Based on how we're declaring it to customs at the time of clearance at the border, it is settled, the transaction is settled, and those goods are released. Once they're released, there is no more money due anywhere by anybody. Those revenues are not to be reported to some tax agency. The individual recipient is ultimately responsible for if they want to return the goods, if they want to do a B2G to get duty and tax back, if they want to export the goods, if they want to use them for continued personal use. If you're shipping as a business formally in Canada, then you would be the importer of record, and all of those transactions would roll up under your business number, and you would report either via CARM or via whatever government agency on a regular basis. And it's a very different environment. So for U.S. Merchants doing business to Canada in the casual stream, after it's released at the border, there is nothing for anybody else to do.
You got something?
I've got like 50. Yeah. But yeah, you know, we're looking at each other here. Like, I mean, there's so many questions next, I want to ask, and we have, you know, somewhat limited time.
So I want to zoom out a little bit here and you know, put myself, you know, in my past life as far as an e-commerce retailer looking to go to Canada. And honestly, I used Landmark.
At the time, yeah, you used Landmark.
And Canada was definitely a huge market, but there was a landscape I had to go through of like, how do I move these goods? If I figure out how to take orders, there's a demand for my product. We're talking casual clearance, B2C. I don't know what I'm doing. I just want to get my packages to my customer and make them happy. So I put everything in place. I collect the landed cost at checkout, make the buying experience super transparent. But then I still have this decision to make of, okay, I got to move the goods. Clearly, there's the express carriers, which are, you know, purple, yellow, and brown, right? And they're fantastic services. I've always viewed them as being a high quality service, but they come at a premium as well. And that works really well for some customers. There's a postal stream, which actually there's some advantages. You know, sometimes going into Canada, the postal stream is desirable because there's some loopholes and things that happen with it. But service times and things can be a little spotty. And then there's this consolidator route, right? Am I summing it up as far as, you know, then you start looking into the Landmarks or the Ascendias and other companies that are kind of piecing together their own networks to get you to into Canada? Would you say those are the three main ways that I could kind of address looking at moving a package into the market?
There's a B2B to C concept that's popping up a little bit where you'd move goods on a consolidated basis on 5 pallets. The import of record would be the logistics company, the e-merchant with a business number in Canada. You bring it into a warehouse. So it's cleared at the border like bulk freight. Then they take those packages and they deconsolidate, and then they clear, and then they deliver throughout. The reason why that is physically the same, but economically different is the import of record. It's a commercial transaction across the border. It's a bulk importation. That is becoming a little more common in that who owns the goods when they cross the border, it can become a gray area. You have the merchant of record who collects money. You have the import of record who has the responsibility for those. And then you have the transportation company. Right now within CBSA and customs, there's a lot that's swirling on the liability and ownership responsibility of the goods by the transport companies or the customs brokers, and, you know, a variety of, there are some, and I'm an advocate for it, where you create a fourth channel effectively, which is the transportation company takes ownership of the goods, economic responsibility, including duty, tax harmonization, and penalties, and then redistributes based on that. But what you said is generally the way that it works. Okay. And
Yeah. So I was just what I'd love to do here is also kind of segment the options and see what's applicable for maybe the smaller merchant that's just getting going. I know often that first mile, getting that enough volume to justify a pickup with some of these companies is not feasible until you get to a certain number of packages a day or a week. And so let's talk first about the small retailer and kind of what their best options are to grow their business to a point where then they can tap into some of these other options that are out there.
One of the things that you just said in terms of zooming out that I think I probably glossed over that I need to reset. Canada has 38 million people, which is the size of California. So in many cases, if you ask any US merchant, what's the size of California? What's the economic opportunity? What's the business opportunity? They light up. It's a fantastic market. Well, Canada has the same economic potential, if not more, depending on a variety of things, than California. So California, Canada, equal in terms of population. And if you're not shipping as many packages as you are to Canada as you are to California, then you need to change something, including how you market, how you distribute, and a variety of things related to the customer experience. In Canada, there are more couriers than there are, I think, in any other market in the world. And I don't know this from experience. Maybe in some Eastern European country, there are 15 national couriers. I don't know. But in Canada, there are more national couriers, regional couriers, final mile delivery, lifestyle couriers, and a variety of other specialty delivery outfits. It is unbelievable. So because the population is so scattered, but also so dense in terms of Southern Ontario generally making up 40% of the overall business, Quebec potentially making up 23, generally speaking, 10. You kind of have this vast market in which not everybody is served equally. So picking these carrier partners by their specialty based on their network and their hubs and their delivery service quality is super important. So when you're a US merchant to Canada, the first thing you say is, do I want everyone to get the same service? Do I want everyone to pay the same price? Do I want to embed duty into my landed cost? Do I want it to be in US or do I want it to be in Canadian? These are all very dependent on a lot of things: the competitive landscape, the retail landscape, how this price points in general, how dutiable these items are, the difficulty of importing in general, marketing costs. So these are all considerations. All that being said, I would say if any US merchant can ship out of the upper Midwest or Northeast, the transit times are going to be 2 to 7 business days. Well, one of the things that we want to revolutionize this go around in my professional work experience is I think counting business days is a tragedy. I think that is a very 1990s, and I don't know why anybody puts up with business day delivery service expectations. We deliver 7 days a week. Canada Post doesn't deliver 7 days a week, so clearly we don't deliver to every point in Canada 7 days a week. We should count in calendar days. People are buying on Saturdays and Sundays. Packages are being delivered. They're crossing the borders. Warehouses are staffed. So speaking in calendar days is really, I think, going forward, what we should be, what the expectations should be in terms of, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree with that because you don't have to rewind very far to where business days was very relevant. But nowadays, I expect packages to be delivered on Saturday and Sunday, and we can thank Amazon for that. But my expectation as a buyer has completely shifted over the last decade.
I mean, it feels like the conversation we had a long time ago of why are carrier fees so expensive, right? And it was because it was built around B2B and high value shipments, charging a disbursement fee or an advancement fee from express courier that's in the $10 to $20 range is somewhat reasonable, and but that was built for that environment. Once it went to e-commerce, it was no longer working, and this sounds very similar, right? And I totally agree that having it counted on calendar days that's for e-commerce, right? And that's what that's the big market, and that's what everybody's going after. And we still have kind of this legacy terminology and ways of looking at things that are limiting possible future growth because we're still stuck in some old mindsets out there with these carriers. Now, I do want to. So we talked about like there's 25 carriers or so. I think you had mentioned spread out doing deliveries. What are like alternate deliveries down there? Like so, there's the local couriers, lockers. Like what do Canadians expect for delivery, and how is that different from the U.S. or any other market? I guess because just how is it different?
Well, Canadians would love free shipping, and some large U.S. merchants will offer that. I think everyone's realistic that that is not profitable and is not sustainable, especially when you're talking about returned goods, anywhere between 10 and 15% of the overall volume. If you go north of $9.99, you might have some conversion issues. I think it's very reasonable to charge up to 10 Canadian dollars for shipping, especially if it's coming from the States and they know it. And that's sometimes not as clear as to whether they're being shipped from Toronto or they're being shipped from Texas. And that's a thing that the merchants have to address is what do they want the experience to be? Want it to look and feel and replicate like it's coming from Canada to Canada or from the States where it's an international border and their expectations are set accordingly. The landed cost, obviously right in your wheelhouse at Zonos, is something that plays right into shipping cost, total cost, what's the total cost related to the item value and that conversion or not. In the case of the regionals, the way that we generally use the regional carriers is we get it to them as far downstream as physically possible. If the package is traveling 1,000 miles, we literally want to move it, 950 of those on our own equipment, and they give it to them within a circumference or a radius that's reasonable for them to serve. Clearly, we don't give our carrier partners packages at 10 a.m. when the sort times previously would have been 5 p.m. So it's a plus 1 day. So we target delivery to all of our partners based on their sort times, based on their regional locations in terms of their hubs. And we try to drive it as far down as we can to where the packages ultimately are going. Now, Newfoundland and the Yukon and, some of the Northern Territories are very difficult to serve. So we'll use Canada Post, who's very capable, by the way, and is a fantastic delivery partner. They're just a little more rigid in what they can do, and some of their costs aren't as efficient as we'd like them to be to the urban centers. All that being said, we have 3 or 4 different regional and kind of middle mile, intermediate zone delivery partners. And in all cases, we pick up on our equipment, move northbound, bonded facilities, bonded highway carrier, do the releases and get it downstream to those points. Generally referred to as the hockey cities is kind of where you want to get to. Wherever they have a hockey team, you better have a depot, you better have a hub, and you better have multiple delivery partners capable of delivering to that population. The other thing you mentioned briefly was lockers. I think this is certainly more art than science. I think 60% or more would like it delivered to their home. And I think that the more options we offer them and the more urban that they are located, I think some of those options open up. The pickup drop-off concept we're tinkering with. We have 4 retail locations that you can deliver parcels to for free, pick up parcels for free. And we're also looking at the locker option. It's a little more delicate when you're talking about hardware maintenance and management. Some condo complexes and apartments have their own locker system, which is great. But those are B2B deliveries in that case. And so the carriers really like being able to deliver 10 and 20 boxes to one location as opposed to individual driveways and front doors.
When you say B2B deliveries, it's going to a consumer, but it looks like a B2B arrival because there's multiple pieces. Is that what you mean by that?
Multiple pieces being delivered by a driver in a van to a commercial address. And that commercial address might be full of residential individuals ordering e-commerce goods. So, and then when you get to,
is it just as simple as the Canadian consumer that locker is like their address, right? That's what they're putting inside the checkout. Is there some work you think that retailers should make in order to say, hey, here's how we support, delivery to lockers?
Well, I really like the optionality of the customer being able to have it delivered to their home, or perhaps for an incentive, delivered to a secure location. It could be retail, or it could be a locker bank. The idea behind the locker bank, similar to an apartment building or to a business address, is you can deliver multiple pieces to one location far more cost effectively. The lockers are great for higher value goods, right? So if the security is an issue, and the technology now in terms of using QR codes and the software embedded in the hardware to open the lockers and activate the delivery experience to be seamless is very good. And it's gone, 10 and 20 years ago, it's gotten much better. There still is a cost and there is an efficiency or density of parcels that you need for that to be effective. But at the end of the day, if you're in the fashion space, whether it's shoes or clothing, the returns rate is high, and the returns are what absolutely kill U.S. merchants' profitability to Canada. And in my case, I actually remember when Zappos shut down Canada because the returns rate was too high, the profitability was too low, and they just turned off the country for cross-border shipping. And that will happen if the returns are too high, too expensive, and not efficient.
So how does a retailer then manage returns then in Canada? Because cross-border returns are, and specifically, I'd love to know about the options for the return, pickup, returning back, whether in bulk or in individual pieces. Because it's different with express carrier. Express carrier, they're an integrator, right? They're going to pick it up, move it, bring it back, gets really expensive. But also, what about duty and tax, right? That importer just paid duty and tax. Let's say it was the consignee was the importer. And then I would love to hear about, what happens with that duty and tax money when a package comes back.
It is such a, maybe not for everybody, but for me, it's a fascinating discussion. You ship 10 orders successfully, profitably to Canada, and 1 out of every 10 is returned. Assuming your average order value is 100 US, 150 US, you may have duty up to 18% on textiles. You might have HST of 13%. You might have 31% the value of that order pending in Revenue Canada's CBSA's hands that you need to get back, assuming that they offer returns and a returns credit for all that's paid. So the first thing is getting the return delivery options for the customer. Maybe it comes with an embedded Canada Post label. Maybe it gives you a list of drop-off points. Maybe you pay, Purelator to come pick it up, and they take it off your credit or give you a credit for that amount. It's like a snowflake or a fingerprint. It can be very, very different per merchant. Our general rule is we want to get it back to as fast as possible to the closest return facility. So if you have one location in Canada or one provider in Canada or no locations in Canada, either way, you're going to need and want a Canadian return address. If you have one in Toronto and that order comes from Florida up through over to British Columbia to Vancouver, it's returned, it goes back to Toronto, it's aggregated, it's consolidated, then it's the paperwork is generated, it's cleared southbound. That could be a month. That could be, you could be talking about up to $100 in handling and shipping just for that one shipment. Then you have the whole life cycle and returns credit of duty and tax, depending on the provider and how efficient that is. So generally speaking, giving them returns options where you use the best provider. Canada Post is the best for returns. I mean, anyone can talk me out of that, but I'd love to hear their argument. If there's a pickup or drop off location, they have local access, then that could, in my opinion, could be changed. But generally speaking, first mile Canada Post back to the closest location. If you're set up in BC, you're set up in Alberta, you're set up in Quebec, and you're set up in multiple locations in Ontario, that return cost is going to be low, and you're going to get it quickly, and you're going to be able to reconcile that return with the merchant. Items received, items returned, condition, etc., whatever the return SOP would be. So, then you have to get it out of the country.
Right. So, but real quick, before it gets out of the country, are you saying when it comes Canada Post, that would be from the Canada Post all the way back into the U.S. or to a consolidation location, right? To the facility, correct? Yeah. Okay. Now back to the U.S.
Good question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
good question. So when I say returns, I'm always thinking about the most local, the most domestic and local, and obviously with the best partner. So using any postal authority or integrated courier for a international return is going to be expensive. There are some cases that I've seen. DHL, for example, offer a returns program out of Canada, or maybe they're putting it on their aircraft and it's going, traveling 1,000 miles to get to a return location in the U.S. But at the end of the day, the jet fuel for one leg of that was probably more than they're charging for returns times 2. So, there are some exceptions to that for large retailers, but generally speaking, Canada Post, get it back to the closest return location and then activate the return SOP that the merchant would set up with the provider. And at that point, we begin the consolidation exercise. Well, do you want us to hold to 20? Do you want us to hold to a pallet? Do you want us to ship daily, onesie, twosie? And then from there, Now, in our case, we put them on our mostly empty trucks going southbound, right? Our package flow is full north, relatively empty south. So returns capacity and southbound freight is abundant. So depending on the returns cadence and what their requirement would be, we would run those southbound consolidations. And then you have the real fun. You get to clear it back into the US. Is it a Section 321 clearance? Well, not technically because it's a return. Is it a 9801? Probably. Well, a 9801 Type 86 where you need manufacturer ID and a variety of other things. So the returns back into the States can be difficult. Most of us consolidators have figured out ways to do it efficiently and effectively. And then you still have to get your money back from CRA and CBSA for duty and tax, which of course we do as well.
Right. Okay. So real quick, because this is interesting. Because you're a consolidator and now when it's coming back into the US, you are clearing this as a larger shipment, a bunch of returns at once. And this is why the clearance, I mean, if this was under the de minimis, right? If these were individual onesie twosies, or even with an integrator, like you can use, I think there's a specific harmonized code for returns that assigns a zero duty rate. So why are you not able to leverage that as a consolidator, that same those same methods?
Yeah, so 9801 is the
that's the HS code.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just now that I'm looking at what I wrote down, it's like that's the HS code. Yeah. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to qualify for this, so it is a consolidation on a return southbound basis. The merchant, the shipper, is the importer of record using that 9801 for duty-free reentry. Yeah. But there are still lots of fields and little things that you have to qualify for in order for that to be a proper duty-free entry. The other thing is, generally speaking, in order to get your duty and tax back in Canada, you need to prove export. And the way you prove export is by having a transaction ID for that export. Tracking number, I think, at a minimum, and a variety of other things accounting for those goods exported. Because, Canada Border Services Agency and Canada Revenue Agency don't want to just give away free money.
So a transaction ID could be a tracking number. That's what that can count as the transaction ID.
So that's a great question for a licensed customs broker because
okay.
I think it's a gray area. My answer is yes. Has my experience ever been a return has been rejected for refund based on it having a tracking number for export? No. But there's some gray area in that. But I would say overwhelmingly yes. So if you have a tracking number for export, you can refund your duties and taxes.
So Dave, talking about the getting that duty and tax back from Canada, does the dynamic change when it's the consignee in Canada, the Canadian shopper, that is the importer of record versus maybe a U.S. retailer acting as the importer of record for the goods going into Canada? How does that change the dynamics?
That's a really good question, by the way. Very good question. The answer is yes. The importer of record, being the consignee, has to give authorization and or clearance authority for both northbound and southbound. So a merchant, in their terms and conditions, at their checkout, on the initial outbound sale, should have language in there that allows them and or a licensed customs broker of their choice to operate on their behalf for both northbound and potentially southbound.
When you say language, does that need to be like a power of attorney, like totally, it's just a terms and conditions acceptance?
It's basically a light power of attorney. That's right.
Well, okay, wait. All right, I'm actually interested in this. So what do you mean light power of attorney? Like, hey, in the agreement, the terms and conditions, when they accept it at checkout, for instance, they could just accept that at that time and be used to...
Well, I think a power of attorney would have a formal document and it would have a signature
right,
giving authority to a customs broker, another party to act on their behalf formally. So when I say a light, meaning this clearance authority statement that you'll find on any of the, anywhere from, I don't want to use brands names, but just all the big e-tailers, they all have clearance authority statements at checkout. And that gives both the merchant, the customs broker, and the transport company the comfort that this consignee understands that we're working on their behalf to clear these goods, that we're remitting duty and tax on their behalf for these goods. And in the event you want to return them, we will then work on your behalf to get those monies back. Yeah.
So, okay, no, this is fascinating. Now, and as we're talking about kind of the import of record, it could be the consignee, it could be, if you had an NRI. That is one thing I think is really important to touch on with some of the time we have here is what is the pros and cons of an NRI? And if you want to touch on CARM, which we're going to have a whole nother discussion about CARM at another time.
Yeah.
But, sometimes you might have a courier that goes in there and pushes an NRI on a U.S. retailer. Others might not. Mm-hmm. So what is an NRI? Well, okay. NRI is a non-resident importer. It's meant for non-residents of Canada, right? You don't have a business entity in Canada. You can essentially get an ID and act as an importer of record without being registered.
And I think it's important to talk through the unique nature of an NRI compared to other countries. Canada's got a program here with an NRI that it's a much simpler way of acting as the importer of record going into Canada. Other countries don't really have that. It's much, much more involved if you want to act as an importer of record in other regions. So Canada's got this unique program in place that to your point, a lot of merchants use. And it gets pushed a lot of times, maybe in cases it should or shouldn't. And that's where I think would be some good feedback from you, Dave, is on, why, and is there anything we missed about what it is, but, around the why, the pros and cons, when it makes sense, when it doesn't make sense, et cetera.
The difference between a non-resident importer and a resident importer would only be the address that you use to file your revenue and your taxes and basically liaise with government agencies in Canada. You are a Canadian business. If you set up as an NRI, if you set up boots on the ground and get a Canadian address and hire employees in Canada, you are a Canadian business either way. You get a Canadian business number. You most likely will get a GST registration number that will allow you formally and legally to collect tax, called GST. In the event that a non-resident importer decides to stop doing business in Canada, it's pretty simple. Just like an LLC in a state, you would then do a final tax return. But you're a business when you set up as an NRI. You are expected to file your revenues monthly, quarterly, sometimes yearly, depending on your size. And based on those revenues, you owe tax based on the destination province or the province that you're doing business in. I think GST and HST are pretty simple. PST is much more difficult. If you go to the province of Saskatchewan and you say, should I be collecting a PST in Saskatchewan? They're going to say, absolutely. Here are your forms to fill out, become a registrant in the great province of Saskatchewan. So the casual importation stream and allows us and everybody to enter the country of Canada without having or triggering provincial tax jurisdiction. Collected at the border is GST and HST effectively at the federal level. And then once you have an NRI, not too dissimilar, you have to make a decision of how you're doing business in each of these provinces. So if you're an NRI, it's B2B. And then you would report all of the revenues and all the tax that you would owe, less all the tax that you would collect. And you're usually in a kind of a refund or a credit or you owe at the end of that period. So if you have a Canadian business number and a Canadian GST registration number, you can collect tax at checkout. You have to formally report your revenues for Canada. And you are under, which I think is really the more important part, you're under commercial guidelines for imports and commercial guidelines for potentially registering products, bilingual labeling, and a variety of other things that businesses would be under as operating in Canada.
Okay, Dave, you bring up a couple of really good questions here. I do want to talk about the labeling thing second, but on the taxes front. So if I set up as an NRI, it sounds like I'm taking on a lot more responsibility for my business to manage taxes in Canada. Now, what I've seen is shipments that are going through B2B, and this is including on an NRI, have duty and the 5% GST assessed. And what you're saying is it's on me as a business to now collect and remit the PST in the provinces that are relevant. Am I accurate in understanding that?
Take PST and quite literally put it on another planet of discussion. Okay. But let's go back to what you said. If you're a Canadian business, non-resident or resident, when your goods cross the border, generally speaking, they only collect import GST, generally speaking, and duty, of course. That's based on the value. When it's crossing the border, the value is either the sale price, or if they're unsold goods, there's another gray area. Get Deloitte and KPMG involved in exactly transfer cost of goods, wholesale, etc. So when they cross the border, duty is assessed on the consolidated value. Okay, so if you have goods that are dutiable, and the aggregate value of those goods is $100,000, that duty rate would be on that $100,000. If that $100,000 is broken into multiple e-commerce orders, non-NRI, meaning a U.S. exporter, then they could qualify for the de minimis that was, again, getting complicated here, was redone in 2020, the new USMCA, 150 up to Canadian duty-free entry into Canada. So you could have more of a duty obligation on a consolidated NRI basis, or you could have less depending on the nature of the goods, where they're made, HTS codes, and a variety of other things. So once you're doing business in Canada, you report all those revenues. Any tax that you pay at the border is credited toward what you collect and what you owe. So if I have a $100 sale and it's to someone in Ontario, and that's a 13% HST market, I will collect at time of checkout 13% of that 100 or $13. When I imported those goods on an NRI basis, I paid 5% import GST. I will then get credited that 5, and I owe CRA 8.
Talking through NRIs, it sounds like if you get an NRI, you're bringing on some extra obligations for taxes. And I'm kind of talking through a little bit of personal experience here, where I've used some services in the past where I leveraged an NRI and did some consolidated clearance and was able to get some better shipping rates. That was my main reason in doing it. But along with that, we bring on extra tax obligations. The other interesting thing that I've noticed is when I did a lot of NRI and non-NRI shipping into Canada, just depending on the transaction, I got audited a couple times on HS codes and things, and I only ever got audited on my NRI shipments. So I felt like it put a bigger target on me, because now all of a sudden I'm a bigger importer in Canada versus all my other ones were individual shipments going to consignees as the importer. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. Previously, you didn't even exist hardly as far as Canada was concerned when you're not registered or you're not an NRI. So the audit mechanism is really what created CARM. The idea of importing $1 million worth of goods and then reporting that you're only selling $500,000 worth of goods on your revenue reports and thus tax filings. Well, there's a disconnect there. You have that many unsold goods in your warehouse. It triggers a lot of things. And that's what CARM really is to reconcile imports and actual sold goods. So in your case with an audit, it's extremely common when you're a new NRI to not only have your first couple of shipments kind of inspected at the border when they come into the country, but also for you to get within the first year an audit. They just want to see, what are your revenues? How are you reporting them? How are you recording them? What are you remitting and how are you remitting? So in the case of border clearances, they have a B3. A B3 is a tax receipt. A B3 says, Revenue Canada, here's what I paid at the border. And then Revenue Canada says, here's your revenue. Here's what you owe us. Here's what you paid at the border, less that, and you have a net amount that you owe. Generally speaking, tax is a zero-sum gain or loss for any merchant. You will never make or lose money on tax. It's unless you're doing something administratively wrong or you're committing some sort of fraud or accident, but it is zero-sum gain or loss. Duty is something that can be a net win or net loss economically. With that being said, you are on an NRI, you are the import of record. Usually, and naturally, that's how it's set up. You are a Canadian business shipping from the States to your Canadian business. Your Canadian business is conducting business with consumers. You were talking about it a little bit earlier. You are obligated for product registration. Other government departments come into play. Bilingual labeling is another gray area. I think you can probably get away with not bilingual labeling, depending on the sales channel, the channel of distribution. But if you have any retail, any B2B whatsoever, it must be bilingual. And again, there's experts that I can bring on if you need for deeper dive into that.
Yeah, the labeling part was definitely something I wanted to touch on, because I know if you're a business in Canada selling goods, you need to have it in French and English, right?
Yep.
Am I understanding that right? And so sounds like there's a little bit of a gray area. If I had to guess, a very small percentage of NRI shippers are actually doing anything with that, just to be candid. But it's possible that you could be taking on a burden there as well, which would be more complex for retailers. So just to sum up NRIs, I'm taking on more responsibility, maybe on the labeling side, on the tax remittance side. I'm going to have a little more focus on me from, not a little more, I'm actually going to have some focus put on me when it comes to auditing and things like that. Whereas if I'm just shipping as the Canadian being the consignee, I'm not on their radar at all. I don't exist. So why on earth would I be an NRI if I can get the goods into Canada with the Canadian shopper being my consignee? What would be the scenarios where the NRI makes sense?
Duty. So if your goods attract an 18% duty and your average orders are above 150 Canadian, say 125 USD on average, that duty rate of 18% is jaw-dropping, in my opinion. If you move the goods unsold into Canada and distribute from within Canada, your duty rate of 18 is on the price and or cost of goods and or transfer costs when they cross the border. So you might move them into Canada unsold, say that same item at $60 US in value. The duty rate clearly is the same, but the amount owed would be half
on the wholesale value. Yeah. Okay, but that unsold term, that I think that's worth talking through. What does that mean? Because I think a lot of the use I see with an NRI is the goods are already sold. And they are the transactions happen. Someone checked out, an order was placed, and now those goods are moving. They've got a final destination already in mind as they cross the border. Is that unsold?
Well, wouldn't it just be as simple as, look, if this is a B2B transaction, right? Because it's a non-resident importer, it is not yet like the actual title of the goods and all of that, right? Like hasn't moved yet to the after you cross. So you cross the border is not for resale. Once it's crossed the border and you ship it, it's for resale. Would that be a decent way to sum that up, Dave? I'm shooting in the dark here. But that's how I would probably try to describe it. So
this is where it's already sold.
Yep.
It's a final destination has been prescribed, but is there a way to justify that type of transaction as unsold, or does it truly have to be, I'm moving inventory into Canada waiting for it to be sold?
Well, let's do an example. Let's say you have an e-tailer, Zonos powered e-tailer that sells shoes, and they've been very successful in Canada. Well, shoes made offshore are 18% duty, 18 and a half, whatever. And let's say they service 43 markets worldwide from the States, generally speaking. We may want to activate an NRI or get them business registration. We may want to activate a warehouse in Toronto and Calgary for those SKUs. And we may want to have those orders pushed to us for fulfillment and distribution. When we move those goods into Canada, those goods are valued at whatever that e-tailer bought them for or made them for, or whatever methodology for cost of goods when they're transferring, crossing into Canada. The duty rate of 18% is due at that time. Once they're in the warehouse and they're sold to a Canadian living in wherever, Montreal, Vancouver, there's no duty that would be triggered or owed once they're in the country. So that is a way to mitigate. Again, I'm going through the different NRI scenarios that would be favorable to a merchant. That's a way to mitigate or lower the 18.5% duty rate. Because when you move them across the border at $50 or $60, and then you sell them for $180, your tax is the same, but your duty is significantly less as a total. And that could just be for Canada. The UK, you may ship from the States. Europe, you may ship from the States. Australia, New Zealand, Asia Pacific. There are cases in Canada where it makes sense to go on the ground. And when you go on the ground, you can't be a casual importer. There's no such thing. So you are doing business in Canada.
So Dave, if if I'm just warehousing everything in the U.S. and I ship it on my NRI when an order is placed, Johnny up in Toronto buys my shoes. What value do I need to put on the commercial
Sale
invoice?
price.
Sale price.
What did you collect from Johnny?
Yeah. So I can't bring these across as being unsold unless they truly are unsold, and I'm warehousing them, waiting for Johnny to buy after they're in Canada.
So that makes sense. Yeah, because we most of the retailers we work with to get an NRI are not warehousing in Canada. Yeah. They're but that's the majority anyway. So
that would be a kind of V 2.5 evolution of growth, right? Before you would propose something like that, it would be they're doing so much volume to Canada, so much revenue, so much tax, that duty is really adding up, and their volume is very good. They may want to look at doing business more formally.
Okay.
But to bring in another wrinkle, there's so many of them, they may not have the licensing rights. They may not have the brand rights if they're a reseller to sell formally in Canada as an NRI. So you have that whole.
Yeah. Man, we could talk Canada for another 3 hours. And so, I do know that some time's limited here. So let's.
I'd like to wrap this up with some simple, simple questions, because I think if I'm a e-commerce retailer listening to this, my head might be spinning a little bit on a few of these topics. So what I'd like to do is boil this down to two main types of merchants. Let's say the ones that are small, trying to get into Canada. What's their best next steps? How should they look at getting in there? And then look at a large retailer and maybe, we could just touch on some of the things maybe we've already talked about, some of the different strategies. But Dave, if you're a small retailer wanting to tap into the Canada market, maybe you already have some volume of a couple shipments a week, or you're just starting out, what's the best way to actually get going and start it into Canada? Sounds like NRI is not the play.
So the only reason you would sign up as a non-resident importer and become a Canadian business is if you are in the direct selling business out of Utah. You're very familiar with these companies, right?
Yep.
And I love working with them, but those aren't e-commerce goods. Right. Those aren't casual importations. Right. Those are businesses selling to businesses, and the individuals at their homes are the business receiving. So excluding that, you would first make sure that your URL and everything that all the search engine optimization and the Canadians can find you, that you have a proper checkout for them. Proper checkout is somewhat subjective. Whether you transact in USD or Canadian, Canadians are very proficient and very much understand what the current exchange rate is, and they know what a good exchange rate is and a bad exchange rate. They're very aware that there may be some pricing arbitrage between Canada and the US. Sometimes .coms are blocked out and they're pushed to an alternative.ca site where the pricing isn't as favorable. So just have all these thoughts and considerations as you go forward, whether you want to go duty in, duty out, whether you want to subsidize Canadian sales by having a duty in and having it, take a small loss on it as a merchant into your cost of goods versus what you sell it for. Have a digital marketing partner, have somebody who can extend the reach of your brand to Canadians, because you need to localize to some extent. It's not everything is US spillover marketing. I mean, not everybody is Nike and Lululemon, where they're just, brands that everybody knows, and that spillover media is immediate and imminent. I mean, it's such a crowded, e-commerce landscape right now, that having a direct marketing strategy to attract and convert Canadian business is important. A payment provider that can settle, whether likely in USD, with you locally here and at a good rate. Landed cost is key. You guys, that's pretty much how you built your business, right? Is effectively saying, who wants to get surprise charges at the door? The merchant doesn't either, because the return rate's exponentially higher than if it's prepaid up front. It's clear, crisp, accurate, and nothing more is due. So, having a good payment provider, having a good landed cost strategy. And then the other things to consider, of course, are who you use in terms of carrier. If you are with a 3PL or a 4PL, most likely you'll be able to kind of tag on one of their programs to Canada. Maybe it's with an integrated courier, maybe it's with a consolidator. But as you grow, I would hope that these merchants would take a little more ownership of the service quality to Canada. And again, that's just a private opinion. So looking at your 3PL, if you're doing it yourself, then there are some good options for some of those shipping platforms that are readily available. Once you reach 20 a day to Canada or more, you're ready to work with with a consolidator, in my opinion.
Okay, so getting to 20 a day or more, your options open up, but it's really important. What I worry about and what I see sometimes is small retailers that maybe have the costs are too high. They don't have the right options there to where they never reach the 20 a day, not because there's not demand, but just because they can't get the cost of shipping down enough. So you're saying there's some options for them out there. What would you, if you were in their shoes, what would be the best path logistically for moving packages?
You're shipping under 5 a day, right?
Yeah. How do I grow? How do I find the right logistics provider to help me get to that 20 a day that's going to open up more options for me?
I would say a logistics partner that can expand. This is actually one of the things we're doing at Broadreach, not to plug the company too much, but if we're just a shipping provider, whether it's a courier or a consolidator, we're just reacting to what you do or don't do well in Canada by just moving the boxes for sold goods. We are using small brands that want to grow in Canada, and we're activating small marketplaces, digital marketing campaigns, retail activations. We're doing pop-ups. We're doing everything we can with these small brands to actually grow their brand awareness, and then, of course, subsequently leading to the shipping, which is our core business. So I would say partner with it could be a logistics company, but somebody who's going to look at growing your brand and putting it front and center, that has the relationship with the logistics provider. I do think there is value to a lot of what Shopify offers in the marketplace, and we do some of the digital platforms that offer more than just shipping services as well. And I think those can be quite valuable. In our particular case, we believe that getting your package 2 to 4 days faster versus our competition is meaningful for the market and its viability in the future.
Oh yeah, I mean the transit times, going back to the calendar days, that speed, and treating Canada very similar to the U.S. market as best as you can to service those customers, I think is the path forward. And hopefully in today's podcast, some of the people listening, are able to understand the details are important, but that over the size of that opportunity. I love how you summed it up as, look at California, and would you ever exclude how much are you doing to California, and then you should be doing that to Canada. So anyway, this has been great, Dave. And again, we could have talked a lot about a lot here, right? Mm-hmm. But appreciate you coming on this podcast and helping us decode the shipping to Canada landscape.
Yeah, I think we were all over the place, and I think in a good way. I hope we sparked a lot of questions that need additional context and dialogue. It's a lot to fit in a small amount of time.
Yep. And
again, it's not just Canada; it's probably all these other countries that are growth targets for merchants. But the important thing is that you have the best service at the best price, and you treat Canadians like your best market. They have an incredible middle class that spends money on branded goods. Customer loyalty in Canada is very high, amazingly resilient. It's just a great market, and if you can iron out all the wrinkles and kinks on Canada, hopefully with not too much damage, I think you're set up to service the world. And from there, it's up to your brand and your product ultimately to do the work.
Totally agree. Well, hey, thank you again.